Hi, everyone. Julianna Forlano here for the Political Voices Network. It's been 20 years since the U.S. drummed up a reason to fly across the world and murder a bunch of people and pillage their natural resources. Which incursion are we talking about? Why, the war in Iraq, of course. Recently, one old proto fascist neocon who had reached his deathbed admitted to what our next guest had uncovered way back when the information would have been helpful if anyone listened instead of to propaganda to our investigative journalists. That's right. Investigative reporter Greg Palast is joining us to talk about the recent confession of political operative Ben Barnes. Palast is known for his investigative reports for the BBC, The Guardian, Rolling Stone. He is the author of How Trump Stole 2020, and his bestsellers include The Best Democracy Money Can Buy and others. Looking forward to speaking with him right here on the Julianna Forlano Show on the Political Voices Network, which is what you're watching right now. Greg Palast, thanks so much for joining me.
Glad to be with you again.
I know it's been a while. I'm happy to have you here on the Julianna Forlano Show on Political Voices Network. So let's talk about this Ben Barnes and his, what is it, a deathbed confession that he made?
Well,
is he going to die? Or is he doing his 12 steps and making his amends?
Well, that's a good question. Who is Ben Barnes? And I don't know, as Shakespeare said, words without deeds, confessions without deeds, never to heaven go. And so who is Ben Barnes and why do we care? What's going on? Ben Barnes was lieutenant governor of Texas 4 decades ago. Big deal. Well, here's the big deal. He just confessed in the New York Times that, in fact, he was directly involved in what was called the October surprise of 1980. What that was, in 1980, if you remember, the Iranian government, the Ayatollah Khomeini, had just come in and he took hostage 52 Americans out of the U.S. Embassy. Now, Carter, after a year of being in the White House and promising not to campaign for president. So here this guy was stuck in the White House for over a year, couldn't campaign for president against Ronald Reagan, but he thought he had a deal to get the hostages out. But what happened, we now know from Ben Barnes, is that the ex-governor of Texas, John Connally, was going around with Barnes around the Mideast, asking and begging the Iranians, saying, don't release the American hostages because then we can defeat Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan will give you a better deal.
Right.
Let me repeat that. And Reagan's campaign manager, Bill Casey, who Reagan later appointed head of the CIA to make sure secrets stayed secrets, that he kept saying, have the Iranians agreed to hold the hostages, not to give up the hostages? So that was the deal. So in fact, they held the hostages.
Treason, right? Is what
they held up. They held the hostage. Can you imagine? And therefore, Reagan became president of the United States based on a lie. It was considered, when Reagan was nominated, it was considered a joke against Jimmy Carter.
Just like president. Trump, he was a joke at first, and now
this is treason. Yes, this is very important. So if you go to gregpalast.com, you can read the article.
And it's such a
Reagan's treason.
Yeah, it's such a great piece. Now, here's a question. You reported on this all these years ago, and so this isn't new information, right? It's only new that the guy, Ben, whatever, is coming out and saying, yeah, I did this. Everything Greg reported was true, and I'm here to tell you it's true.
Now, there's 2 stories here, and this is what's important. So number one is why now? Like you say, why now? He waited 40 years. First of all, it is treason. He's literally saying Ronald Reagan and his campaign were literally saying, hold Americans hostage. And by the way, 2 of those hostages didn't survive. So you're talking about killing Americans, holding them hostage for a year so that Ronald Reagan could become president. And by the way, when Reagan fulfilled his promise. If you remember, following that was the Iran Contra Iran scandal, the arms for hostage deal. So that what happened was they held the American hostages, the 52 American hostages. Then they grabbed another American an AP reporter, and some others from some other countries,
Ooh.
Hezbollah, and Reagan gave the Ayatollah Khomeini, supposedly our sworn enemy, the guy that was holding Americans kidnapped, he sent them guns and weapons, and even Ronald Reagan even had Ollie North fly to Tehran and give a birthday cake to the Ayatollah Khomeini in the shape of a key, the key to Reagan's heart. Now,
Oh.
I can't make this up. This is treason. When, first of all, it's a crime to kidnap people, and if you tell someone, hold those people hostage, you are now the kidnapper, okay? This is kidnapping crime. It is a crime against America. It is the definition of treason, and Reagan got away with it. In fact,
Do you think Reagan would have won any other way against Carter in that
no,
election if it
no.
wasn't for this October surprise?
No, what happened? No, not he couldn't have stood a chance. All the polls were against him. But what happened with Carter is that he played the Iranian hostage game. He played it up like I'm the great president because he was running in a primary that he was losing to Ted Kennedy. So he was challenged, Jimmy Carter, by Ted Kennedy. And so he came up with this rose garden strategy where he stayed at the White House and said, Americans are held hostage and this guy's running around the country complaining. So it was at the beginning of the hostage crisis, you had the usual rally around the flag. It was like 9/11. You know, it was one of those things where everyone rallied around the flag. But after a year of this, people got sick of it. So it defeated Kennedy. But then Carter defeated himself because he said this is the only issue. And of course, he screwed it up. He wasn't able to get the hostages out. He didn't know why. He thought he had a deal with the Iranians. But Reagan, he didn't know, secretly was cutting a deal with the Iranians to keep Americans hostage. Now, here's where, now let's follow the money. This is very important, Juliana. Ben Barnes. Who is this Ben Barnes? Now, the answer is that he's also the guy. He's also the guy. When I was working for BBC and The Guardian, BBC Television, The Guardian, I have been investigating Barnes for 40 years. He was the guy who arranged for George W. Bush, for baby Bush, to get into the Texas Air Guard and out of the war in Vietnam.
Get out of going to Vietnam.
So this is very, very, this is so number one, so Barnes kept stum about Reagan's treason, and Reagan was elected president. He also kept stum about arranging for little Georgie to dodge the Vietnam draft and get out of the Air Guards. Now they were all and get into the Texas Air Guard. Now understand, to get into the Texas Air Guard is a jet fighter pilot. By the way, don't make fun of Bush because he was so fierce. He was so fearsome, little W, that the Viet Cong never attacked Texas.
Wow.
And because of that, everyone wanted, people are going to Vietnam. This is my era. I was in the Vietnam lottery. And, you know, we had a lot of Americans dead. Everyone was trying to get out of the war in Vietnam. But Congressman Bush voted to send other men's kids to Vietnam. And W's grandpa, Senator Bush, Prescott Bush, voted to send other men's sons to Vietnam, but their own other men's grandson. But little Georgie, they made the call to Ben Barnes to get little George out of the draft. Now you have to understand, he's the only guy ever admitted to the Texas Air Guard as a jet pilot who's never flew a jet. All these guys were experienced flyers. He's also with his best friend Salim bin Laden, who was a flyer with him.
That name sounds familiar.
I'll touch that in a second, but he and Salim were the only two Air Guard pilots during the war in Vietnam who actually put in writing that they would not go to Vietnam. Not that they were war protesters, they were chicken hawks, right? This is the family that was promoting the war, but he actually signed a paper, which I have, which said, I won't go to Vietnam because you have a choice. All the other Air Guard pilots flew missions. And I did this Now, this is important. Why we go back to this guy, Ben Barnes. By the way, the side note on bin Laden, please be careful. I know people are going to say, wait a minute, his best friend was Salim bin Laden. Yes, Osama's brothers. But remember that Osama had 51 brothers and sisters, 51 brothers and sisters. Most of them had nothing to do with him. And Salim, there's no connection whatsoever between Osama and Salim. I will say this, that another investigation I did for BBC television, said that when we talked to CIA and FBI officials, and well, I should say more the field operators and agents, they said it was impossible to investigate the bin Laden family because of their close personal and financial links to the Bushes. This does not say 9/11 was an inside job. Please don't start sending in notes and letters.
Yeah,
No,
don't send notes and letters.
I have no information about some inside job. All we know is that it was hard to investigate the bin Laden family because of these connections. That doesn't mean it was an inside job. So that's a side note, but it's important to note that Salim and little baby Bush said they won't go to Vietnam while they're, but now what did Barnes get out of this? Why did Barnes keep this quiet too? He was nominally a Democrat, by the way, Barnes.
You're the best interview because you ask the questions and then you just answer them.
Well, because I want to get the story out. It's a little complicated, but that's the other thing. That's the other reason why the media doesn't touch it. It's a little too complicated. So, so what happened is that Ann Richards Governor Ann Richards of Texas was running for re-election against this guy George W. Bush, and it was down to the wire. Ann Richards went to Ben Barnes and said, "Please tell the truth. I've heard that you arranged for Bush to dodge the war in Vietnam, dodge the draft." And Barnes refused to make it public, and Ann Richards lost to W. So, and of course he kept stum. I uncovered the story in 1999, before Bush ran for president, just as he was beginning to put this together. Now, Barnes says that history needs to know what happened with the October surprise. That's why he's coming out now, because Jimmy Carter's dying. No. Sorry, Ben. History doesn't need to know.
Right.
The voters needed to know in Texas that they had a chicken hawk running for governor who was a big warmonger. Let's go to war. And then later the war president take us to Iraq, the guy who refused to serve his country and dodge the draft. Now,
but you love to get dressed up in the fatigues and parade around in front of the Mission Accomplished banner. This was,
right.
Greg, may I ask you, this goes out. I know every time I've had you on the show, you always kind of stick to the facts and what's known and what's not known, and you do not make inferences. But I'm going to ask you if you'd be willing to just be the person and maybe not the investigator at this moment. Let's wax poetic about what
take off my hat.
No. Because your metaphorical hat. I love that hat.
Right.
We can't.
That's my investigator hat. If I'm wearing the hat, I have to.
Do you know how hard I literally tried to be like, to take off your investigator hat? But I tried to get around that sentence, but it was the only way I could give you the meaning I was looking for. Anyway, let's wax poetic. When I was reading your article, I was thinking, gosh, if this one guy had done the moral thing, and come clean, or maybe not done it in the first place, whatever, where would we be as a nation?
Well, we would have had one less Reagan and two fewer Bushes. And let's put it this way. If he had not kept quiet, Reagan would not have been elected. Also, he knew, it turns out, Barnes also knew that George Herbert Walker, Daddy Bush, was, of course, involved in the cover-up knew about Iran-Contra and covered it up. So we'd have saved Bush 2, Bush 1, and Bush 2 with the story of the Air Guard. Now, here's what happened with the story of the Air Guard. Again,
wow.
He kept, now this is very important, follow the money, $23 million. And by the way, I want to tell people, if you want to get this full story, I made a movie for BBC television called Bush Family Fortunes.
Yeah.
The BBC has allowed me to make it available this week free. If you go to Greg Palast, the next week or so, free. If you go to gregpalast.com, you can download Bush Family Fortunes. Yes, we're
going to put that in the link right below this.
And I got to tell you, it's at least as important now as it ever was. And the thing is, so what happened was, so Bush gets elected over Ann Richards as governor. Barnes has been removed as lieutenant governor because of his own little financial scandals. And he becomes a lobbyist for a company called G-Tech, which controlled the Lottery of Texas, the biggest in America, and the Lottery of Britain. So I was assigned to investigate G-Tech. This is how I got this story. I'm working for The Guardian and BBC in London. And I'm looking at this company, G-Tech. And then I find out that the Texas Lottery director has bar G-Tech from operating the lottery because they were a corrupt organization corrupting politicians and regulators. So so the lottery director said, G-Tech's out, lose a multi-billion-dollar contract, had a bid, got a different company. What happens? There's a meeting between Ben Barnes and the new young governor, George W. Bush. 2 days after the meeting of Barnes and Bush to discuss G-Tech, suddenly, 2 days later, the lottery director is fired. The lottery director is replaced. The company that was to take over the lottery is barred. And G-Tech is given back the Texas lottery, despite corruption charges, without even bidding for it. No bid, multi-billion-dollar, permanent, forever contract for G-Tech. What a deal. And guess what? Ben Barnes gets a bonus from G-Tech of $23 million.
I'd like to comment about how they waited an extra day and they didn't do it the very next day.
He didn't just call.
Right. Lest it could look bad. Now 2 days is fine.
Now, I want to be very careful here, like I say, about not going beyond the evidence. Okay. I wasn't in the meeting between Governor Bush and this skanky guy, lobbyist.
That's odd.
Barnes.
They didn't invite an investigative journalist.
They didn't invite me in.
Closed door meeting.
I can't say. Barnes has said that there was no quid pro quo between being silent about the draft dodging, and Bush pleasuring Barnes's company and Barnes getting $23 million.
Has he gone back on that?
But let me ask you a question. Does a gentleman have to say, did Barnes really have to say to Governor Bush, I hold your political career in my pocket and your dad and Reagan's memory and everything else. I've got it all in my pocket. And by the way, my company G-Tech's having a problem with their contract. Suddenly it's solved. He gets $23 million. Gentlemen don't have to make the threats in open. It just happens.
Did Ben Barnes come out and admit to that as well on his recent?
Now here's the weird thing. Barnes, yes, had another this was his second deathbed confession. He didn't tell the people of the voters of Texas about the draft dodging in '99 or the people of America in 2000. He didn't tell, he kept it all stum, even when I broke the story for BBC television and The Guardian. He finally, in 2004, after Bush was already elected president, he confessed at a meeting of veterans, yes, I helped Bush dodge the draft.
How'd that go, that meeting? How'd those veterans take that news, like, for real?
That's a good question. I can tell you that I went down to the Texas Air Guard in Austin for BBC. You'll see this in the film. I'm in front of the jets and everything. And those guys hated Bush. They hated him because he was the only guy who said, I'm not going to fly. I'm not going to do any foreign missions. I'm not going to Vietnam. I'm not going anywhere. I'm just going to fly over Texas. And they really resent this guy because then when he became president and we invaded Iraq, Bush W, to cover his own tracks and say the Texas Air Guard's a fighting unit, sent those Texas fighter pilots to Iraq.
Wow.
And they're running. And so the Texas Air Guard was actually running missions in Iraq every day, taking their lives in their hands.
Wow.
Those soldiers, the soldiers I dealt with and spoke to, hated him. And that's
so interesting because he ran on he ran and continued this farce that he was buddy with the armed forces and all of that. Yeah.
Yes, that he was. Yes, he was the war president.
The propaganda machine. Talk a little bit about, at the end of your story here, I encourage everyone to go and read it over at gregpalast.com. You talk about how some of the news media, the corporate media, what happened there? And there were some wonderful people trying to do good work and they got screwed. And there were some not so wonderful people, one of which you'll certainly know because his name recognition is, he was a household name. Tell, Greg.
Okay, so what happened is back in when I did the Texas Air Guards. Well, first of all, the guy that uncovered the October surprise, I didn't uncover the October surprise. That was uncovered by, to me, one of the greatest reporters who's ever walked this planet, Bob Perry. He uncovered the October surprise, the skanky deal to keep the hostages held hostage. Then a couple years later, he's the guy who uncovered the Iran-Contra scandal as well, Bob Perry. This guy's an amazing reporter. He uncovered the arms for hostage deal where the Reaganauts and Ollie North gave the guns to the Ayatollah, and then took money from the Ayatollah and bought guns for the Contras to create death and mayhem in Nicaragua. Now, so Perry uncovered two of the biggest stories in American history. He didn't win a Pulitzer Prize. Rather, he was fired by the AP, then by Bloomberg, then by Newsweek, then by The Nation.
Wow, even The Nation, huh?
Even The Nation, because he did a story on the richest guys you never heard of. He helped me with my first documentary on these very rich guys that were completely invisible in America, called the Koch brothers. But exposing them as behind the right-wing operations. That was Perry. So Perry ended his life not with the big awards and applause. He ended his life. He died young a few years ago.
I remember.
In journalistic exile.
But he didn't have to go on his deathbed and make some confessions to a president who's also on his deathbed. My brain is still in what would have happened if we didn't have Reagan. Reagan, he did so many things that, like, for example, he made the abortion the big wedge issue that it is today, when Republicans were pro-abortion and a lot of them more than they are now.
Actually, here's an interesting one, a good footnote for you. Billy Graham opposed the anti-abortion movement. He said we should stay out of that stuff. There's nothing in the Bible about this. This is not a religious issue. But it was actually a program. It was decided, just like the way that Trump took on immigration after doing polling among Republican voters. They found that they could make this an issue to beat up Democrats. But the religious right, they didn't think that abortion was a religious issue. But let me go back to one other thing. You mentioned a household name.
Oh, yeah.
A guy, Dan Rather.
I've heard of him.
Now, so when I did the story of the Texas of Bush getting bounced, getting out of the war in Vietnam, dodging the draft by getting through Ben Barnes, getting through the Air Guard, and the $23 million payment for silence that won the silence. Rather grabbed my story. He didn't contact me at BBC. He just decided he was going to just rip the story. He got a few facts wrong while he was doing it, by the way. Anyway, he found out what happens when you take on the powers. Dan Rather was fired for saying that George Bush dodged draft. Remember, this is 2004 when
it's
Bush.
It's so weird because we all know that now.
Okay, so Bush, everyone takes it for granted. But I had to break the story. I had to fly to Texas. I got inside documents from the Department of Justice, everything. And I spoke to one of my sources who I can mention now because Dan Rather did something ugly. His name is Lieutenant Colonel Bill Burkett, a true hero. He was number 2 at the Texas Air Guard, and he saw all the documents and blew the whistle. He was willing to talk to me on camera, and he talked to Dan Rather. He gave Rather all this information. Then Rather publicly, to save his own job, because Rather was fired, and they said, unless you retract the story, you're done. So he retracted the story of Bush dodging the draft, even though it was 100% true. He retracted the story. Leslie Moonves of CBS said there's no evidence that Bush ever dodged the draft, and we've seen no evidence. So I sent him the evidence and said, here's I offered CBS's president $100,000 if he could say that our evidence at BBC was wrong. He never did. Of course, $100,000 to Leslie Moonves is like, that's what he pays his chauffeur, right? And but so what happened was that so he retracted this story. We know, by the way, I'm not guessing that he retracted the story in return, even though he knew it was true, in return for getting back his job at 60 Minutes. And then after he retracted the story, CBS reneged on him. So he actually sued. And the judge said, wait, you make this creepy deal with CBS, they don't go along with it? He said, well, when you sign a contract with snakes, hey, they're still snakes. Too bad, Dan. And
Mm.
so Dan was willing to sell out the public. Remember, Bush is running for re-election as president of the United States. And here, Dan Rather goes to the mat, retracts his story that the people need to know about. And Bob Perry, he's unemployed
Well, that's
because
probably why
all
he
he
didn't
did
wanna
was tell
do
the
it. He
truth.
was like, "Look at Dan Rather, look at Bob Perry, I don't wanna wind up," Yeah, but Dan Rather could have gone out with the respect of the American people by saying, "This is the story," although it
Well,
was before the internet where you could just start a podcast and
well, he
be
did.
on your own.
And by the way, he went over to HDTV or whatever, where he still remained a coward. And I don't say that like I still don't say I say that like don't say it lightly. I did a story for BBC and British papers about the real truth behind the Deepwater Horizon,
Oh.
and his people said, "Oh, we want that story." And I said, "No, Dan won't have the guts to run this story." We did it at BBC, and of course he never ran the story. Also, he wanted. I remember to just show you how American news reporting works. 60 Minutes came to my office. Dan Rather's producer, the one who got fired with him over the Texas Air Guard story, Mary Matlas, and they said. They want to do my story of the removal of black people from the voter rolls in Florida. And they came to our office and said, wow, we gave them the list of people. They said, wow, this would require hours and hours of calling people, getting information. I said, yeah, that's called reporting. Like in our last investigation, we made 800 phone calls.
Yeah.
We go undercover. They don't do any of this stuff in American reporting. So that's why you want to see Bush family fortunes, because you'll see a BBC film, you see what we do at BBC that you don't do in America. It's called real investigative
Well, that's why
reporting.
I like having you on the program, and I even feel sometimes like you're the YouTube audience just likes things in tiny bites, and they we sometimes we zone out as a people when actual information is coming to us, and I think the internet has done us a huge disservice in terms of really having having our brains set to have to do all of this research in order to get to that fact.
Minocqua Brewing Company is excited to partner with Equality Vines to create Choice Wine. Choice Wine comes in two choices, Rosé and Sauvignon Blanc. This wine was created to support women's reproductive rights after the Supreme Court rolled back Roe v. Wade in 2022 and caused chaos all over the country. For all you viewers on the Political Voices Network, go to choice.equalityvines.com and type in the promo code PVN to get 10% off on Choice Sauvignon Blanc and Choice Rosé.